All right, so a lot of people have asked me for my opinion on the Freedom Convoy in Canada. The Freedom Convoy is a bunch of truck drivers who decided to get in a convoy, drive into Ottawa, and basically lock the city down. They've blocked roads and bridges from the United States to Canada. They've done a lot of things. They've been honking their horns. And this is all to protest mandates being set by the government regarding COVID. Now, I've been asked my thoughts on this quite a few times, and I have a lot of thoughts. I'd like to share them with you. It's hard because it's hard to organize my thoughts. This is not as simple of a question as people might believe. Now, what are they really protesting against? What they're trying to say is that they don't think the government should be making decisions for other people with regard to their own health choices. They're saying that a person should not be afraid of losing their ability to earn a living because of choices that they make about their own health. Now, the counter argument to that is that it's the government's responsibility to, especially in times of a pandemic, like we have with COVID-19, that it's the government's responsibility to do everything they can to stop this virus from spreading and save as many lives as possible. So then you have to analyze the steps the government is taking to save lives, and you have to analyze the effectiveness of that and determine whether or not it's within the government's right to take those steps based on the effectiveness, if that makes any sense. Now, this is where we're going to get into a little bit of my opinion on the, on the validity of this protest from the truck drivers. And one thing I want to say about that is that there's a lot of information that has changed since 2020, that if you said these things back then, you would get banned from social media, your YouTube platform would be shut down. We already know about all these things. You would be convicted in the court of public opinion for spreading misinformation. I have some links that I've got pulled up on my computer here. One of the first things that we're being told that if you say this, you're spreading misinformation. One of the first things that people said when COVID-19 first became known and the government started responding to it, the government shut down, at least here in, I don't know if it was the United States first or in the states, or if the states by themselves made these decisions. But I know that here in Ohio, I remember one night my wife called me and said, hey, tonight at 9:00, all restaurants in the state of Ohio are going to be shut down. And, that's when this whole lockdown phase began. Everybody who could work from home did work from home. You couldn't go out to restaurants. You could only get takeout. You were told not to go shopping. Some states even shut down sections of grocery stores because they thought they only wanted you to go. It was insane. The number of things that were locked down. People weren't allowed to go visit their boyfriends and girlfriends. It was nuts. But here's a study from Johns Hopkins that said lockdowns had little to no effect on COVID-19 mortality, but had a devastating effect on society. I agree with that statement 100%. I have a degree in economics. This is one of the things that I was saying when this all began. The people who I was really worried about were a lot of the small business owners, particularly restaurants, because they completely took away their ability to make a living. And, I know that there were government programs and stuff put in place later, but the effectiveness of that is now being called into question by a major research institution. I don't think that can be discounted. And then we've also had drug overdoses have increased over that period of time. Suicides have increased over that period of time. A lot of people, I'm seeing it just socially. There's a lot of anxiety and fear and all this stuff that's come about from people who have been sheltered in their homes and not interacted with people. So the effects of that have been devastating our society. And there's a little bit of evidence to show that that might not have been necessary. What's the next one? Oh, this is a story from the CDC saying that this simple cloth mask that people were putting on, that we were being ordered to put on, and that in some cities across the country, people are still ordered to wear, that simple cloth mask is not exactly super effective against slowing the spread of this vaccine or of this virus. It's funny. I listened to a podcast that makes fun of people who confuse the word vaccine with virus, and I just did it. So anyway, but that's, if you questioned the necessity of wearing a mask in the past, you were banned from social media, your YouTube channel was shut down, and you were being labeled as someone who spreads misinformation. Well, now there's the CDC is coming out saying something very similar to that. The other thing I want to talk about is this vaccine mandate, because everybody was told that we have a vaccine. If everybody goes out and gets the vaccine, the virus will be stopped dead in its tracks, and you will no longer transmit this virus to other people if you've been vaccinated. The problem is with the way this, and I'm not going to get into the science of it, but this particular vaccine, the way it was designed, and it turns out that the effect it has on the virus is that it might reduce your symptoms and things if you come in contact with the virus, but it does not stop your ability to spread the virus, and doesn't even prevent you from getting the virus. So we were being told that we needed to lock down our society and wear masks and do all these things until a vaccine became available, and then that vaccine would save us all. And we were told, listen, this is what happened with smallpox, polio, all these other things. The problem is those vaccines were different than this one. It's undisputed now that if you've been vaccinated for this particular virus, you can still get sick with this particular virus. If you've been vaccinated against this particular virus, you can still pass this virus on to other people. So now we can begin to question whether or not it's within the government's authority to mandate that you take this medical treatment. And that's exactly what the trucker convoy is protesting. Now, I mentioned before that if you support peaceful protest, you should support the way these people are protesting, because what they're doing is peaceful. And I want to touch just briefly on kind of the hypocrisy between the way these things are being looked at, because I need to leave this small because my face covers it up. But here is a very famous news story from CNN that happened during the riots of 2020. And the headline reads, "Fiery but mostly peaceful protest after police shooting." We can listen to it.
Christine, Laura, what you're seeing behind me is one of multiple locations that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the course of the night. A second night since Jacob Blake was seen shot in the back 7 times by a police officer. And what you are seeing now, these images came and come in stark contrast to what we saw over the course of the daytime hours in Kenosha and into the early evening, which were largely peaceful demonstrations in the face of law enforcement. It wasn't until night fell that things began to get a little bit more contentious. Things were thrown back and forth. Police started using some of those crowd dispersal tactics like tear gas, even playing very loud sounds to push them out. And then what you are seeing, the common theme that ties all of this together, is an expression of anger and frustration over what people feel like has become an all too familiar story playing out in places from across the country, not just here in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
So there you go. When people in Kenosha, in this particular case, were burning down buildings, burning up car lots, breaking windows, looting stores, and stealing TVs and stuff, they were considered mostly peaceful but fiery protests. And they were angry. So even though there was a little bit of violence, it was okay because they were angry and they were tired of the way they'd been treated. I would say that in Canada, and actually it's spreading around the whole world right now, there's a lot of people who are very angry and they're tired about the way they're being treated. But here's what the media has to say about them.
Sedition, insurrection, a threat to democracy.
This city is under siege. They are now calling it an occupation.
Alarming situation there in Ottawa.
The police chief is calling it a nationwide insurrection driven by madness.
This is kind of our insurrection by air horn moment. I think it's part of the globalization of Trumpism.
Canadians know where I stand.
There hasn't been as much violence as some had perhaps projected, but that does not necessarily mean that it has been peaceful.
Reports of severe vandalism and criminal behavior.
Streets are clogged. The honking is incessant and deafening.
This pandemic has sucked for all Canadians.
Residents that I have spoken to who say they feel terrorized, intimidated.
Residents say they feel like hostages.
Residents in that area say that they are being held hostage, that this freedom convoy, as they call it, has essentially imposed a lockdown on them.
Some protesters harassed a soup kitchen.
These anti-vaxxers actually took food from the mouths of the homeless.
Hungry, yeah.
Because they're so put upon.
There have not been any violent outbursts. However, horns have been honking for 12 to 21 hours a night.
Alrighty, so when you're throwing Molotov cocktails and burning entire used car lots full of vehicles, you're considered mostly peaceful, but fiery. But when you're clogging streets and you're beeping your horn, you're considered an insurrectionist, and that you're violent and that you're terrorizing people. This is a double standard that I can't stand. Let's just put it that way. I'm trying to be as politically correct as I can, and I'm trying not to come across as being upset. But this kind of stuff is insane. The fact that we had people for months on end in the United States destroying inner cities, literally burning them down. If you drove down like the main street of any large city in the United States in the summer of 2020, you would find that the overwhelming majority of the businesses had their windows boarded over. This was not because there was a peaceful movement happening in the United States, but the message that was being told by the media was that it was in fact peaceful. And there was a bunch of decisions that came down because of what happened in 2020 in the United States. I know that where I work, there was a court ruling that said we are no longer allowed to use chemical agents in order to disperse crowds of peaceful protesters. And the decision went on to define what makes a peaceful protest. And one of the things that they said is that if people are gathered in large groups, blocking roadways and preventing people from traveling, that was still considered a First Amendment right, and that was considered civil disobedience and a peaceful protest. So we are not allowed to use chemical agents on those people. Here we have a very similar situation in Canada, where you have a bunch of truck drivers who park their trucks and lock them in a manner that you can't move them without a crane, and they are considered terrorists, and their funds are being frozen. Do I have a story about that? Yeah, here's a story where, everybody's heard the news that GoFundMe raised like $10 million or something like that to give to the Canadian truckers who are blocking Ottawa and doing their protests and all that. Well, GoFundMe decided to, at the behest of the Canadian government, freeze those funds due to violence or due to threats of active violence or the potential that this might become violent. But there are still Antifa groups that are collecting money on GoFundMe right now. The Black Lives Matter groups are still collecting money right now. Here's a story about bail funds that were set up for to bail rioters and stuff out of jail after they destroyed property in 2020. And the current vice president donated money to one of those funds that bailed out someone who was accused of murder in the city of Minneapolis during that time. So if you can freeze funds that are going to a bunch of truckers who are honking their horns, maybe you should have froze these funds. Or the other way around, if you're not going to freeze funds that are used to support riots and criminal behavior that happened en masse across our entire country, maybe you shouldn't be freezing funds of a bunch of truck drivers who are parked in the road and beeping their horns. The hypocrisy in these situations it's insane. I don't know how more clearly I can say it. So one thing I will say is that I don't support people blocking roads. So I think that if you go to block roads and police officers walk up to you and say, hey, you're blocking the road, you need to move, you should move. And if you don't do that, then I think the police should be allowed to use various means of force to move those people. But what we see right now is there was a precedent set back in 2020 throughout the whole year. We set a precedent where we said, hey, this kind of activity is okay. If you want to go out and block roads and stop the free movement of travel of different individuals, we're telling you that this is an okay activity to do. So now you have a bunch of truckers up in Canada, and they're following your lead. They're saying, oh, you have deemed this to be a peaceful protest. This is a peaceful means of civil disobedience. We are now going to follow your lead, and we are going to do the same thing, except they're not doing the same thing because they're not bringing Molotov cocktails and smashing windows and looting and burning and all that kind of stuff. They are using their horns. So if you support peaceful protest, you should be supporting what these truckers are doing right now. And if you claim to support peaceful protest and you're complaining about what the truckers are doing right now, or you're calling them terrorists or insurrectionists or whatever it is, then you're a hypocrite. Those are my thoughts for today. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.